Prefiguration or dual power, Infoshops and revolutionary anarchism in the 1990s. A few years ago, I helped organize what we called a Week of Anarchy at the Antidote Infoshop, which I helped run at the time in Ithaca, New York. We hosted a week of talks, discussions, meetings, a film screening, and an expanded version of our weekly Food Not Bomb serve. It was all very successful and well attended. We thought it boded well for the future, but the Infoshop fell apart just a few months later. We had hoped that the Infoshop would expand our capacity for new projects, but in fact, it did the opposite. Most of our time was spent just attempting to keep the space open and make monthly rent. We were surprised and dismayed at this, but in retrospect, I have a sense now that we were simply repeating a previous generation's mistakes. A couple years later, I started doing archival research for my dissertation at the Interference Archive in New York, and I found a large number of documents from the United States Infoshop movement in the 1990s. I was amazed to read many of the exact same debates, discussions, and problems then that we had in our own Infoshop in 2018. This drove home for me the importance of movement history. So, what do we have to learn from it? In this talk, I'm going to give a brief history of the US Infoshop movement in the 1990s, as well as critiques of the Infoshop model, particularly from the Love and Rage Revolutionary Anarchist Federation. Love and Rage, which was the biggest nationally oriented anarchist organization of the 1990s, argued that Infoshops should be subordinated to the task of building a revolutionary movement and dual power. They were inspired by the Zapatistas in Mexico, who they saw as a model and a vision of the future. Ultimately, the debates over Infoshops reflected very real differences in revolutionary strategy and tactics that are relevant for today's movements. Part 1. What are Infoshops? Where did they come from? And how did the US Infoshop movement develop? In the 1990s, the Slingshot newspaper, which was run out of the Long Haul Infoshop in Berkeley, California, defined Infoshops as, quote, a cross between a radical bookstore and a movement archive. Activists go there to read or buy movement literature, buy paraphernalia such as stickers, masks, and spray paints, attend meetings, lectures, or films, or just plain hang out, end quote. Although Infoshops have somewhat fallen out of favor today, there are still a few notable examples across the US, from Berkeley's Long Haul to the base in New York City. The modern Infoshop model was born in West Germany in the autonomous movements of the 1980s. During this decade, young rebels squatted hundreds of abandoned buildings and turned them into group housing, radical performing spaces, movement bars, and cultural centers. Many of these squats included a dedicated zone for distributing radical literature and other information. These spaces, which they called Infoladen, Infoshops, soon became their own thing. They spread across Western Europe in the 1980s and became an integral part of autonomous and anarchist movements. In the late 1980s, a small number of US anarchists visited Germany. They stayed in squats, and they were amazed by what they saw as the advanced state of the radical movement and its infrastructure. This alternative, squatted world was far beyond anything that the Americans had seen elsewhere. These travelers brought home new ideas, approaches, and tactics, particularly on the one hand, black bloc tactics of street fighting and defending the squatted buildings from the police, but then also the model for Infoshops. The first explicit Infoshops in the US were founded in the late 1980s. Perhaps the most important, and certainly the longest lasting, was the aptly named Long Haul Infoshop in Berkeley. I recently interviewed one of the founders of the Long Haul, as well as the Slingshot newspaper, who himself stressed the importance of the German influence. Meanwhile, in Minneapolis, backroom anarchist books played a key role in bringing together the anarchist scene there, which included everything from the Baldies and Anti-Racist Action to the Revolutionary Anarchist Bowling League. This infoshop was central to organizing the 1987 anarchist gathering in Minneapolis, which they called Building the Movement. This was the second in a series of 4 annual convergences in the US and Canada that revitalized the national movement in the depths of Reagan's presidency. But the InfoShop movement really took off a few years later, after the failure of the resistance against the Gulf War. Although it was fairly large and militant, the anti-war movement definitively lost, both in their immediate goal to stop the war, as well as in their broader attempts to reorganize the US left in the context of the fall of the Soviet Union. Some anarchists blamed a lack of infrastructure and institutions which could sustain and build the movement. In the next few years, anarchists began setting up infoshops across the country, which spread rapidly from 1992 onward. There was the Emma Center in Minneapolis, the A-Zone in Chicago, the A-Space and Wooden Shoe in Philadelphia, Trumbleplex and 404 Willis in Detroit, Blackout Books in New York, the Beehive Infoshop in Washington, D.C., and many more. For a while, it seems that infoshops were popping up everywhere, from big cities to college towns. Although anarchist strategy was hotly debated within the infoshop movement, the implicit strategic model was generally that these sort of free spaces would prefigure the future anarchist society, as well as provide infrastructure for the anarchist movement itself. So meeting and event space, distribution of radical literature like books and zines, as well as often selling punk records and DIY merchandise. And the idea was that this model of these free spaces that were autonomous and democratically controlled would more or less spontaneously proliferate across all of society without need for a centralized revolutionary organization. But as the movement developed, many anarchists did recognize the need for national communication and coordination between the infoshops. Many of them came together to form the network of anarchist collectives. Rather than attempt to make any sort of binding decisions at a national level, or even really to exist as its own political entity, it would simply facilitate communication between local collectives. In order to accomplish this task, the network of anarchist collectives published a zine called Disconnection, which functioned as a sounding board for the infoshop movement. Anarchists often used it to advance political arguments, but they also just shared what they were doing in different locales, thus providing inspiration to others. The network published 5 issues of Disconnection over the course of several years. The production group and city rotated with each issue, which, let's be honest, typically isn't the most sustainable model. But for a few years in the mid-1990s, the infoshop movement thrived. It expanded rapidly, and it seemed to provide a new basis for the anarchist movement. But the infoshop movement had issues of its own. Common problems confronted almost all of the local collectives, including racism, sexism, gentrification, the dominance of punk subculture, and a lack of political orientation and revolutionary strategy. This wave of the infoshop movement receded in the late 1990s, although it experienced a revival in the wake of the anti-globalization movement. What went wrong, and how did people diagnose the problems? Part 2. Anarchist Critiques of the Infoshop Model. Here I will briefly zoom in on one case study, the Beehive Infoshop in Washington, D.C. It was opened in October of 1993 and lasted around a year and a half until April of 1995. Beehive was founded by a group of young punks, almost all whites and vaguely middle class. Some had been involved in the positive force house associated with Minor Threat and Fugazi and the broader hardcore punk scene in DC. But they wanted to create a more explicitly political space that would cultivate anarchist community and anarchist organizing projects. The Beehive Infoshop sold radical books, records, and zines. Most importantly, it was a free space that was open Friday through Sunday with a zine and book library, free clothes, and meeting and event space. Despite a promising beginning, the Infoshop soon imploded in spectacular fashion. Debates flared over oppression within the space and the potential gentrifying role it played within the neighborhood. Communication broke down, and the Infoshop was even raided and vandalized by 4 women, including 2 members of the collective, who accused the Beehive Collective of sexism, racism, and classism. After the Infoshop dissolved, several participants swore off the Infoshop model, publicly critiqued it, and turned instead towards other forms of anarchist organizing. The most well-known account of this comes from Brad Siegel in his article Demise of the Beehive Collective, Infoshops Ain't the Revolution, which he published in the Love and Rage newspaper in 1995 after he moved to New York City and joined the organization. Siegel identifies 4 major problems that he thinks together doomed the Beehive Infoshop. First was little participation from the local community. So in order to get cheap rent, the collective found a storefront in a poor, mostly black neighborhood that none of them lived in. The Infoshop then caused an influx of middle-class white people, even if they were mostly dirty punks hanging out at the Infoshop, and this was arguably an important first step of gentrification in the area. But in any case, the Infoshop never really managed to connect with the surrounding community, in part because of Siegel's second point, the dominance of punk rock culture. Even though the Infoshop was opened as a conscious attempt to escape the punk scene, Brad Siegel says that the Beehive, quote, experienced the strange tendency for punk to dominate all that it comes in contact with, end quote. He thinks that this subculture almost inevitably drove away the few non-punks who turned up from time to time. Many people seem to see it as more of a punk clubhouse rather than as a welcoming community space. In addition, there were bad internal group dynamics around race, class, and gender. The Infoshop and the collective that ran it was dominated by a few middle-class white men. Even as they did attempt to interrogate their position and adopt active anti-racist and feminist approaches, they still tended to do things like dominate conversations, and several women in the collective reported feeling alienated by meetings and events. Some of these same women also criticized the group for its role in gentrification and argued that some of the items in the shop were offensive, including certain posters of punk bands. As I said, these arguments got out of hand to the point that communication had totally broken down, and 4 women staged a raid on the collective in which they tore down several flyers and posters. While the specific targets are perhaps dubious to a degree, including a flyer advertising a Riot Girl meeting and an anti-gentrification poster, it was a clear sign of how bad things had gotten. The fallout from this marked the beginning of the end of the Infoshop, and it closed down soon after. Perhaps most importantly, though, and underlying everything else, Siegel says that in the Infoshop there was no unifying vision, no clear goals, and no real strategy. Conversations about political strategy were avoided, and the collective statement of purpose was vague enough to allow for basically anything. If you remove some of the more abstract political language from it, you are left with something more akin to a public library, but one that is poorly staffed by punks and closed half the time they said they would be open. Was this the most valuable use of the time and energy of the precious few revolutionary anarchists in the DC area? In the end, running an Infoshop required an enormous amount of time, energy, and work. and it all produced very little in the way of political impact. Now, none of these problems were unique to the Beehive Infoshop. In fact, these all mirrored common trends in the Infoshop movement across the US. And these dynamics soon led to many of the spaces dissolving in similar processes as the Beehive, though not usually quite so dramatic. For his part, Brad Siegel concluded that infoshops might be part of a broader revolutionary movement, but that discussions about vision and strategy must come first. Anarchist strategy cannot just be an unspoken reliance on the spontaneous proliferation of free spaces and counter-institutions. It needs to deal directly with the reality of state power and the rule of capitalism, not to mention white supremacy, imperialism, and patriarchy. The only way to defeat these enemies is to build a fighting revolutionary movement. So what is the alternative to infoshops and spontaneous free spaces? Movement building and revolutionary dual power. So Brad Siegel brought this conclusion to Love and Rage, which did prioritize strategic discussions. They rejected the idea that anarchist infrastructure like infoshops or community gardens were ends in themselves, or that building and expanding them constituted revolutionary activity in itself. Rather, they argued that infrastructure should be subordinated to the broader needs, goals, and strategy of the movement. Love and Rage based its revolutionary strategy on building grassroots dual power. Their model for this became the Zapatistas, who demonstrated revolutionary dual power in action beginning in 1994. The Mexican chapter of Love and Rage, Amor y Rabia, provided one of the most important links between U.S. anarchists and the Zapatistas. The chapter established a movement house called the Martyrs of Chicago Direct Solidarity Encampment in Chiapas to support Zapatista projects, including a school and a women's center. Members of Amor y Rabia published reports on the Zapatistas in their newspaper, and they conducted interviews with many leading members, including the iconic Subcomandante Marcos, which were translated for the US-based Love and Rage newspaper. This was one of the only early sources of in-depth information and analysis on the Zapatistas for US radicals. In a strategy document titled Dual Power in the Selva Lacandon, Love and Rage co-founder Chris Day lays out the lessons they took from the Zapatistas. Most importantly, dual power does not consist of small free spaces or cooperative businesses that compete on the market. Rather, dual power is a stage in a revolutionary movement in which mass democratic structures are created that challenge the rule of the state and capitalism. The foundations of dual power institutions are created within the movement itself and subordinated to revolutionary needs and strategy. Chris Day argues that the Zapatistas went through four pretty distinct stages, although they sometimes overlapped, in a process of building revolutionary dual power, which eventually led to the possibility of the insurrection in 1994, which was followed by the creation of genuinely democratic autonomous municipalities that exist to this day in different forms in tension with the Mexican state structure. So first, Day says, was the development of revolutionary consciousness. This took place for around 10 years even before the actual insurrection in 1994, when guerrillas went to Chiapas and started training in arms and training their communities in arms, but also had political trainings where they helped develop an analysis of society and how to change it. Second was direct action. This consisted of things like lands takeovers and defense. And in many ways, this went hand in hand with the development of revolutionary consciousness. Third was the creation of counter-institutions. Now, this could be something like a coffee production co-op, but rather than seeing it as something that was an end in itself that existed on the capitalist market in order to make more money for coffee producers, The Zapatistas saw it more as a way to funnel money to buy guns and other resources for the guerrillas. So the counter-institutions themselves, even as they developed democratic forms that prefigured the future, were ultimately subordinated to the needs of the revolutionary movement. Finally, Christe says that the fourth step was the construction of organs of genuine dual power. And by this he means the autonomous municipalities and grassroots governmental structures in Zapatista liberated territory that actually fulfilled all of the functions that the Mexican state and capitalism was attempting to provide, so that they were an actual alternative power structure that competed for the loyalty of the people of Chiapas and Mexico with the Mexican state. Now, these existed in tension with each other and theoretically cannot coexist forever, right? Dual power is meant to resolve itself into a single power, even if we're thinking in an anarchist model where it is a very grassroots movement and democratic and localized and decentralized. But the key here is that Christe says that this process of building dual power through these four steps happened over the course of years, over the course of a decade, in a conscious, deliberate strategy, right? That the political vision and the political discussions came first, and then the counter-institutions and other structures of dual power were built in order to facilitate certain movement goals. Again, to underline the point, dual power consists of mass democratic institutions at the grassroots level that both meet people's needs directly and challenge the hegemony of bourgeois institutions. This sort of dual power institution is always in tension with the state and capital, and this tension cannot last forever. Eventually, one side has to win and establish its own hegemonic system. This is a question of building a revolutionary movement. So the lessons that Love and Rage took from the Zapatistas were clear. We cannot solely prefigure the future in small alternative institutions like Infoshops, but rather we must build movements and revolutionary dual power structures that challenge state power. Dual power does not just prefigure the future society in a small activist space, but rather is a strategic orientation towards a revolutionary transformation of society as a whole.